welcome. And this is something of a repeat of the session that we had at the summit, but with a bit more detail in the presentation due to the format. So I'm Jess Daggers. I'm the head of research for the Transcap Initiative, which involves lots of things. But one of the main focuses of my role is around this question of measurement. And that's partly because it's been something that has occupied me for a long time, something that I find really fascinating, and that I think is really core to so much of the work we do, and is also responsible for a huge amount of wasted energy. So I think there's really potential here for kind of rethinking, redesigning the way we think about measurement so that we can just do things better and better respond to the crises that we are all facing globally. So I'm going to give just a little bit of background on Transcap more generally, just in case there's anyone on the call who isn't familiar with our work. And then I will plunge into the measurement topic, the measurement question. The plan is to speak for roughly kind of half the time that we have, and then to open up for discussion. So hoping that there are people here who are thinking about these issues, grappling with them, really keen to hear about people's thoughts, experiences, reactions to what I'm going to talk about today. So Transcap, we have a vision statement, which is all about improving the way sustainable finance is purpose designed and managed. And the core of what we're doing is about bringing systems thinking into finance. So we think that systems thinking and complexity science has a lot to say about the way the world works that is not currently recognized within sustainable finance or even impact investing. But we also recognize that there's a huge gap between the way investment logic works and the way systems thinking works. So we're at the intersection of those things, trying to think through how do we make these ideas tangible and accessible to the investment community. So I'll just give a few words on the foundations of our thinking and what that means. If anyone has read the white paper, this will be familiar. If anyone's not read the white paper and you're interested in this, it gives a really good kind of in-depth exploration of a lot of this work. So one of the things we talk about is recognizing complexity. So this is about changing how we understand the world, like what is the nature of the world we live in and the way that change happens. So the focus here is very much on the interactions between things, the connections between things, and by looking at just recognizing the vast number of things that interact in any context, you see that there's a huge degree of unpredictability of the way the world works, that you cannot reliably say in complex contexts that if you do one thing, something else will follow from it. And if you think about any kind of thorny social problem like homelessness or obesity or any of those big problems, you can see that there's a kind of unpredictability and an intractability about how to work in those systems. The roots of the thinking that we use are in complexity science and complexity economics. These are really big fields, and actually systems thinking and complexity science, as I've discovered as I've come into this role, is an umbrella for a huge number of sub-sectors, sub-disciplines, some of which are very, and there's a lot of variation across those. But we see those as a big resource for thinking. When you do want to go into detail on things, there's some really quite substantial work that's gone on over decades that helps us think through the work we're doing from quite a grounded perspective. So those disciplines bring new perspectives on the world and the effort to create change, and new kind of planes of analysis, new kind of framings to put over reality that helps you think about action and measurement. So as well as recognizing complexity, we talk about working in systems. So if recognizing complexity is about recognizing that the nature of the world that we live in, then working in systems is about changing the way that we work. So it's adapting our mode of working in a way that suitably recognises the complexity. So the idea about creating change itself changes, that you reduce any notion of being in control and being able to unilaterally bring about change. Even the billionaires of this world are limited in their ability to change systems. Instead, we should be thinking about collaboration across multiple partners, and never being able to directly control where a system goes, but instead trying to influence the direction of travel. So these are some of the founding assumptions, and I think Donella Meadows, she always comes up, her work, whenever I go back to her work, I find it just resonates so much, even though she was writing a little while ago now. She wrote, "Systems thinking makes clear even to the most committed technocrat that getting along in this world of complex systems requires more than technocracy." And I really like that idea, because it highlights that systems thinking, systems change work is not just about new analytical tools. It's not just about mapping and dynamics and leverage points. It's also about bringing a different mindset to the way that we're working, and recognizing some of the deeply embedded assumptions in our ways of working that stop us from having the impacts that we want to. So this, I want to bring attention to this, but I'm not going to go into it in any detail. At TCI, we're doing a lot of work on core methodology, and this is work that we are intending to publish as soon as we can. I want to highlight that the measurement stuff is very much part of a bigger conversation around what does it mean to do investment, to do systemic investing. And that's a bigger question that we're really actively working on in various ways. These key concepts help to communicate some of the breadth of that work, that we keep trying to reduce these and find it's impossible to do, because there's so much to this idea that when you start adopting the systems perspective, the implications for investment logic are huge. So we're working through those as we're going, and yeah, as I said, we'll be seeking to publish. So that work is very relevant, and if you're interested in this topic, I'd suggest kind of keeping up with that. There is also a webinar that my colleague Ivana presented. There's a recording of that online that goes more into the basics of systemic investing, if you want that additional context. So if we turn now to the question of how do we measure impact in complex systems, so I wonder if this might be a question that a few people on this call have brought to the webinar, to the meeting. Today I want to explore the idea that this isn't actually the right question to start with. I think if this is where we're starting, we're going to find ourselves getting stuck. So in the section we're going to now, I'm going to explain my reasoning in saying that, and hopefully bring you all with me towards a new set of questions around what the measurement thing should be focusing on. So you may be familiar with the work of Rob Brasiliano. He was at our summit and has done a lot of work in this space, looking at systems and complexity. And I've borrowed here from, this is an article he published a few years ago now, which talks about the distinction between cloud type problems and clock type problems. I just find this is a really helpful way of kind of really grasping the difference between conventional, traditional approaches to finance and systemic investing, what we're talking about. So just quickly to cover this, a clock type problem, if you imagine a clock, you can take it apart. It's got lots of pieces that fit together. They're very precisely made and constructed. You can take it apart, you can put it back together, you know the role of each piece in that clock. And then the outcome of putting those things together in that way is predictable. A cloud has a completely different nature. It's unpredictable, it's hard to control, it's endless and evolving. And Rob's argument in this article is that a lot of the tools that we have as a society are making the underlying assumption that the problems we're solving are clock-like. when actually they're cloud-like. So we're bringing clock-like solutions to cloud-like problems. And that's quite a powerful way of identifying why so many of the things we do don't seem to be helping to improve the problems that we're facing. So just to give a quick example, if you're thinking about homelessness, the urgent need to get somebody off the street and into shelter could be seen as a clock type problem. It's quite complicated. You need the logistics of having a place for them to go, reaching them, arranging things. The more general problem of homelessness is more of a cloud type problem. There are so many factors that affect whether someone's on the streets, and thinking about how to permanently change that you'll be better served using cloud type solutions for that cloud type problem. So if we have this distinction between clock and cloud, I think it's really interesting to then introduce the idea of impact into this distinction. So impact, as it's currently understood a lot of the time, is it's clock-like in the sense that we're talking about defined outcomes for defined stakeholder beneficiary groups. Especially within the investment world, you end up breaking down the concept of impact into component parts as if it's clock-like. So that's a very standard feature of the way that impact is thought about. If you bring the idea of impact into a cloud type scenario, it becomes much less clear that thinking about impact in that way is going to help you to get anywhere. Because if you're recognizing that there's lots of things interacting all the time, there's emergence and there's unpredictability and evolution, then any attempts that you make to put a kind of measurement framework over that, define changes that you want to measure, then attribute them back to a particular intervention, begins to look pretty futile. So systemic investing is very much kind of sitting on the cloud side of this distinction. As I said before, we're taking that complexity view of the world and thinking about how to bring it into the work of investment. So as I said, the measuring and managing impact grows very much out of clock type mentalities, clock type solutions to thinking about social problems. On the cloud side, the main implication to my mind, as someone who's spent a lot of time working with measurement methodologies, is that there's actually just a very clear limit to the knowability of impact. I think we need to, if we can recognize that limit and really give it space, then we're going to start asking very different questions about what measurement is for. And I think that that idea of limits to knowability is something that we should be holding on to and keeping in mind as we have these conversations. That's also one of the main critiques that I would offer of the way impact measurement has been done so far, is that it doesn't really admit any limits to knowability. It assumes that you can know what your impact is, and all you need to do is build the right measurement framework. And that's leading to huge amounts of energy going into these frameworks and processes on the promise of giving you knowledge about impact that improves decision making. And I don't see how those frameworks can ever follow through when most social problems that investors are trying to address are actually complex in nature, and therefore there is a limit to what we can know about impact. One thing I should make very clear at this point is that this is not heading towards an argument that there's no point measuring anything. There's definitely things we should be thinking actively about measurement, about knowledge generation. We just shouldn't be starting with the assumption that impact is the thing that we should be measuring. Okay. So in terms of the work of TCI then, and what we're doing in thinking about impact measurement, I'm phrasing it at the moment as a kind of resetting the question. So we might, the kind of the obvious way to go is to go from, well, in sustainable investing and impact investing more generally, the question is, how do we measure the impact of an investment? So then you go from there to how do we measure systemic impact? And I think that's not the most helpful place to go in the first instance. Instead, given the foundations of systemic investing, what I was saying at the beginning about complexity and using a system lens, a different way of working, given the fundamental rethink of investment logic that this entails, so we're reworking what it means to do investment, given these perspectives, and also given the implications of complexity for measuring and understanding change, I think the question we should be asking is, what do systemic investors need to know to invest well? So we're opening up, instead of saying how do you measure impact, we're saying what do we need to know to invest well? And invest well is deliberately quite kind of an open question, because we're also here to rethink what does an investment approach look like that can address systemic problems effectively. That's where all the key concepts come in. So these are big topics that we're opening up quite deliberately, because we think that's needed for the scale of the crises that we're facing. So this is a pretty exciting place to be. Impact measurement, as I've said, like my career over the past kind of 10+ years has been studying and working in impact measurement in the investment space. And you end up in these very kind of narrow conversations around, given, we've assumed that we can measure impact, we've assumed that we're working within conventional investment logic, and the options that are left to you there are actually pretty limited and not at all suited to answering questions around impact, which is this big, complex social change question. So if we can put a lot of those questions to one side and instead ask, what do systemic investors need to know to invest well, we're free to open up a much more kind of productive and imaginative conversation around what this could look like. So in doing this work, we want to create space to re-examine measurement practice and investment practice concurrently, because they should be going hand in hand. It's not really, measurement isn't really a question that you should be talking about on its own. It has to flow from the way you're working. So if we can also change the way we're working, the way we think about investment, then the measurement questions come in and they can be very pertinent and relevant. This also means reconsidering what success means, because in impact investing, success has often been defined in terms of these impact metrics, whilst maintaining kind of standard financial return metrics as a powerful kind of driving logic. So we're taking a kind of pretty overall look at what success is and how measurement ties into that, for both financial impact across the board. Like we're not separating it out into different strands. This also involves reconsidering accountability, because that's another reason why impact measurement is done, is because it's treated as an accountability mechanism, at least in theory. So we're not saying investors shouldn't be accountable. We're saying let's look at what they should be accountable for when they're doing systemic investing, and the answers will be quite different to what impact investors might be accountable for. Big implications for governance as well, and that's actually something that Rob Vasiliano and various other people are working on, is what does governance look like in complexity. So we'll be seeking to join up the dots on those conversations. And then the last point here is that in this conversation that we're seeking to open up, there's also scope to take a broader view of what kinds of knowledge are valid. And this is I find this one especially exciting, because when you're leaving so much of investment logic intact, you're actually looking at very narrow options for what knowledge looks like. You're looking at metrics, you're looking at things that can be put on a spectrum where things going up is good and things going bad is down. And you're looking for things that can be kind of evidenced and quantified. And then you get into the kind of monetization debate, which takes everything even a step further. In this situation, we can start asking, well, if we're reworking what investment logic looks like, we're asking a different question about measurement, then different kinds of measures could be feeding into these systems. We had sessions on Indigenous investing, Indigenous knowledge at the summit, and I think I'm hearing reference to Indigenous bodies of knowledge more and more in the kind of spaces that I spend time in. So that's a really interesting area of exploration, is what would it even mean to start embracing those kinds of knowledge on their own terms and bringing them into this kind of investment decision-making space. It's really important to acknowledge that this work, a lot of this work is being done already in different ways, and we are really seeking to learn from others in doing this. Just want to highlight a few of those, and if anyone on the call in the discussion afterwards is sat there thinking about an initiative you know of where these questions are being asked, then I'd really love to hear about it. So the evaluation space is hugely active on these questions, not necessarily in relation to investment, but in relation to more kind of philanthropic activity. There's been decades of work of evaluators thinking, if the work is being framed in terms of systems, how do we develop evaluation methods that are appropriate? Because a lot of the traditional kind of log frame type models are not. So Rockefeller philanthropy advisors have been doing work on shifting systems for a while, and they've released some evaluation reports which are very thoughtful in how to think through these problems. The UNDP have it's called the M&E Sandbox. If you Google that or go on LinkedIn, they've got an increasingly large kind of collection of online case studies, discussions, seminars around exactly this, systems and complexity and evaluation. There's also quite a lot has gone on in the public policy space, because people have been arguing that public policy evaluation needs to move beyond a kind of more traditional mindset and to embrace complexity. There's even that the UK government have substantial guidance on evaluation, and they've published a supplement specifically on evaluating in complexity that was published a few years ago. So it's recognised even within pretty mainstream settings like the UK government. There's then, obviously, as I said earlier, the work in complexity economics and complexity science. They're all bubbling away as domains of action that are thinking about these questions, or another resource. The Cynefin framework, I think, is worth mentioning, because they're also doing, it's a kind of management framework that looks at what does it mean to manage in complexity. So they're asking this question of, how do you think about collecting information or data from the outside world to understand whether you're achieving what you want to achieve? They talk about probing, sensing and responding in complex systems. And then the Deep Transitions Lab is another initiative that's talking about the work of deep transitions, socio-technical systems, grounded in a substantial body of academic work. And they talk about transformative outcomes as a way of thinking about the change that needs to happen to transition from where we are to the next iteration of our society. So this is just to say that in asking this question of what do systemic investors need to know to invest well, we're also asking how do we translate existing knowledge into the investment context? Because a lot of this work, there's a different the investment context has its own kind of peculiarities that we need to be aware of, and the way impact investing and impact measurement is developed has not been particularly well connected to the evaluation space, even though evaluators have been trying to measure impact for decades, for a really long time. So we need to be aware of why these other areas of thinking haven't made it into the investment space, and just be active in thinking what's different about systemic investing and how can we bring those things in. Okay, I'm about to stop talking. I think just to flag up, so we are at still quite an early stage in thinking about how to do this work. It's very exploratory. We do not have clear answers or a particularly well-structured, elaborated project plan. What I've given you today is most of where we've got up to. So just to give a sense of what will be happening as far as we know. So we're in the process of forming a project plan. And as we get kind of further down this line, we will be looking for collaborators who are thinking about these issues at the methodological level. We'll need, this is not something that we can do alone. We need it to be a kind of a shared endeavour. It'll be particularly interesting and necessary to have organisations who are actually trying to build the measurement systems, who are doing this systemic work, and to work with them in understanding whether anything we can put out can be useful, or even kind of testbed kind of options. We are, of course, always looking for funding opportunities. That the more this work can be funded specifically, the more it can move ahead and happen. And we just need to make sure that we're connected with the broader landscape of work in this area, and we're not, duplicating work or going off down a track that should be shared with someone else. So I think I'll leave it there, and I'll hand back to Hannah. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really fascinating and interesting, and sparking lots of questions. We are going to open it up to the floor. I don't know if it can be a floor in a Zoom room, but we'll go with that. We've got one or two in the chat. I don't want to hear the sound of my voice overly. It's a bit dull. So if you are putting stuff in the chat and you're happy to speak to those questions, I will come to you. If at any point you don't want to do this, or private message me and I won't come to you directly. The other thing to say just before we start off on those questions, and while you've got them all whirring around your head and popping them in the chat or sticking your hand up, or however you want to engage in the conversation, is that we are obviously recording this session. We are recording some of these sessions in order to share them. If you do not want to be on the recording, that either gets shared around to everybody who signed up, but also with the possibility that this might end up on our YouTube channel. If you could let me know either in the chat or on email, that would be wonderful. What we can do is we can cut the video so that we only share the bit that Jess presented, so that your faces and names are not on the recording. If that's kind of your way of working, that's totally fine. So just kind of offering that up into the room so that you can make a call about whether you want to be on that recording. So with that being said, Alexandra, do you want to, you've got a couple of questions. I think your brain's been whirring. Do you want to speak to them?
Sure, my cloud-like brain. Good morning, everybody. I am quite new to this, so I apologize in advance if this is a naive question. I'm at the Harvard Business School Social Enterprise Initiative, and we do a lot of work on social entrepreneurs and systems change. And part of that does include, well, how do we know if we're making a difference? So I was really intrigued by this conversation, Jess, and I am a big cloud lover, so I particularly like that analogy. But you were just winding up to the punchline, and then you said, okay, now we're done. And I was like, but wait. So I would love to hear your thoughts, or anybody's thoughts, about really two things. One is, you said the right question to ask is more about, what do investors need to know? And I think of investors as, not necessarily people who are putting money in, but it could also be a board or other stakeholders. So what do they need to know? How do you figure that out? I understand that there isn't a specific answer, that it's probably contextual, but sort of how do you take the next step and figure out what they need to know? And I think the second question, as a board member of a social enterprise, is, okay, I'm on board, but how do you manage people's expectations? Like, we're putting our time and energy and money into this, and typically we would expect to see metrics and so on. If there's a different set of expectations that we should be setting out, what are they and how do we introduce them? Thanks. And I really appreciate this series so much. By the way, I've learned so much.
Cool. Okay, I'll respond to that straight away. So, I mean, the answers come from the specifics of the way that you're doing things. So I apologize in general for this whole area. You know, it's the inability to give kind of just clear, straightforward answers to things. I appreciate that can be frustrating. But the point I was emphasizing about also looking at investment logic and redesigning that is a big old question that then comes down to land, and it looks quite different in different places. So for us doing the work on systemic investing, we can't really begin to answer those questions of what does this look like until we're in the context of doing systemic investing in a place with a set of stakeholders. And then from there we can start to ask these questions of, given the way we're doing it here, what does it look like to do this well, and what given the limits to knowability of impact, what are the things that we can meaningfully start to measure and explore? So in your case, the answer would also be kind of really rooted in the way that people are working, which is hopefully, you know, systems informed. The systems perspective needs to be kind of infused through the work and the measurement approaches. You can't have one and not the other. I mean, in terms of managing expectations, I think one thing I'm hoping we might be able to do through this work is to help make it easier for the people who, so I've had a few conversations with people, you know, who are working in a systemic way and are constantly in conversation with stakeholders who don't take a systemic perspective, and this expectation that you measure your impact has been embedded. So they get faced with this question the whole time: what are your impact metrics? What, you know, when can you prove your impact? What are your frameworks? What do they look like? And being able to respond to that when, you know, if you're in the kind of systems perspective complexity type position, it's really difficult to answer those questions, because you actually need to go back so many steps to be like, I need to explain why your questions don't help. They don't help me do the work. I can give you metrics, they won't help me do anything better. They won't tell you anything. So I'm hoping one thing we can do with this work is to help to explain why it's so relevant. I guess, you know, a summary of the kinds of things we've been talking about today that people can use to at least kind of clear the space for, let's have a more sensible conversation around what metrics and measurement we should be doing. But the positive answer to that question of what should that look like is harder to answer, and I'm very kind of humble about not having lots of clear answers at this stage around what that looks like.
Yes. We've had an extension of that from Alexandra, just about whether you have any examples that you could share on the work, and then I'll come to you, Ivo.
Examples of which
Alexandra, do you have a particular thing that you were looking for?
An example of, so I appreciate what you're saying about it has to come from the context, but if there's an example either that you could share live or offline of how an organization did that, sort of how they took the context and worked within it to figure out what they needed to know, that would help me kind of get to the next level of understanding.
Yeah, I think it's something we're going to be actively thinking about. This stuff is so new. So I'll log that request. I could give you an abstract example, but I don't think that's hugely helpful at this point.
Thanks, Jess. Ivo, I hope that's how I hope that's how I've pronounced your name. I hope I have pronounced your name correctly. Take it away.
That's a wonderful way of pronouncing my name. Thank you. And thank you very much.
What is it really? Because I don't want to do it wrong. How do you pronounce it?
I say Ivo, but either one works.
I mean, it's your name, so you get to choose which way it's pronounced, right?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. I was really curious about this because we are working sort of we're sort of the example that you've talked about. So we're an initiative working on systemic impact, and we negotiate a lot with the partners. And there's a wish for impact measurement. We've run through, I don't know how many accelerator programs that have tried to help us measure our impact. And basically my answers each time, like, it doesn't make sense. This is not how we work. This is a waste of energy. Part of me was hoping to be proven wrong here. I'm glad to see I was not completely off on the other side. So accepting that we can't really measure impact in a systemic approach. What about knowing whether we're moving in the right direction or not? So because in the end, like if it doesn't come from a control paradigm of the funder, let's say we're all together trying to figure out, are we doing the most meaningful work here? And impact measurement, I think in a way is a bit of an awkward way of doing that. Do you have thoughts on how can we know whether we're doing the most meaningful work here?
So, I mean, I think they're big questions. What I do have a thought, if anyone on the call has been trying to do this work and has some suggestions, and please do chip in. So I think one avenue I'm interested in pursuing is around, so instead of focusing on impact as in change experienced by beneficiaries out there in the world, you start borrowing ideas from systems work. So the idea of system health is one that comes up, and that potentially, if you're working to change a system in partnership with lots of other people, you could be putting a frame over the system that you're working in and using system science or systems thinking to understand what makes that system healthy or not healthy. So you get ideas like ability to adapt to shocks is something that is a general feature of systems that could be something that you can gather indicators on. So you might be able to see that the system you're working in is not able to adapt to shocks. It's very fragile and it's going to collapse if something bad goes wrong. Maybe your work is to strengthen that system's ability to adapt. And there's ways of understanding that strength, and then there's ways that you can measure that strength. So it's a completely different lens on the work that offers that maybe then the indicators you gather can actually be give you meaningful information about whether you're going in the right direction. The last thing to say there is that in that you move away from the idea that the thing you're looking at is down to you, that you created that change, because system health is clearly something that is beyond any single actor to influence. So partly in moving away from impact, the idea is to move away from this idea that investors can claim that they did a thing and that that's important to the whole endeavor.
Which is probably a very important step away. Thank you. That's a very inspiring thought. I'll take that with me.
Thank you. John, I'm going to come to you next.
I was just typing my notes from that last question. It was a great answer. Jess, this is really, you got me thinking a lot. It's really insightful. There's a lot to think about here. And I really agree with your conclusion and some of the statements you made about the inefficiencies of impact measurement. I'm going to cite if I got it correctly, your argument that the philanthropy and the impact measurement world has been struggling with this for a long time. And that's an example of the problem. Although I'll come back to that in a second. Where I'd like to get your reaction is one aspect that I differ from, like how we get to that problem, which is the way you described it, which is, in my mind, the financial markets are a complex adaptive system, a complex adaptive emergent system, and therefore they're our cloud system. But yet data works very well in the financial markets. And I would say it's because there is a very high correlation between the quality and the quantity of the data and what people want to get. And there's not a lot of variance in what people want to get. People want financial returns, right? So it's like, it's pretty easy in that world to create it. And so I just get your reaction to this thought that maybe the problem that you're getting to is less because of is maybe perhaps more explained by the lack of consistency about what people even want to learn, and not necessarily the clear correlation between the available data and what people want to learn. It doesn't really lend itself to that kind of financial approach, even though finance is still a complex emerging world. And then if that's true, well, I'd love to have your reaction to that as a concept, but then one of the arguments that the M&E people make in philanthropy is, yeah, we can't solve this problem for the world, but we can solve it for you like for your foundation, we can get a methodology that works well for you, and that's actually an acceptable solution, is to have, you know, asset owners that have some solutions that work for themselves, but even recognizing they're not consistent necessarily amongst asset owners. And is that maybe perhaps where we end up here?
Okay. On the first point, I would say, so those data points work very well in a very limited way. So they work for stakeholders who want to generate returns. There's a kind of system there that you can play, you can manipulate in certain ways. But the consequences, there's a kind of, they work well because so much is pushed off the table. Like you've got these metrics that tell you certain things, and then most of the picture gets kind of pushed out of view, and the consequences of that are the crises that we're dealing with. So the financial world has allowed itself to operate in a bubble. So I mean, these are very big topics that it's difficult to kind of succinctly express these ideas, but I think that it's in some ways a red herring that the data flows in those markets have the appearance of working well because they rely on so much else going on that it does not function for society as a whole. So there's a kind of an illusion there. In terms of the philanthropy question, so I'm not sure, because I think, so I've understood the question as you kind of have to narrow down your scope to what you can know to make it workable. Is that what you're pushing at? That
what I'm getting at was, okay, so the management and evaluation world in philanthropy's got like 30 years of thinking about whatever it is, right? They got sciences and organizations, and it seems to me that they come to the same problem you just described, which is they agree that there's not a common metric system that everyone can apply. But what they do is they argue that, you know, Gates can do this, Ford can do this, that each organization from within itself can come up with a metric system that helps them make decisions better, right? They can basically take the what questions do we need, your general framing of like what questions do we need to know to make ourselves do our job better, and come up with a metric system that works for that org. And it's maybe I'm observing it incorrectly, but that's what I've observed of that whole world, that it's sort of solve that the lack of generability problem that you're discussing by encouraging the development of bespoke methodologies that are appropriate to different organizations for themselves. And I'm wondering if, first of all, maybe that's described wrong, but if you think it's described correctly, do you see maybe that's where this goes, where the large organizations come up with their own unique individual ways of doing this, but we don't have this sort of a general metric system that everyone will subscribe to?
So yes, I think the idea of a general metric system is not helpful. It's on many levels, and it's especially once you start adopting a systems perspective, it becomes even less helpful, because you're so abstracted from any particular context, and the chances of those metrics really telling you about anything about the context that you're working in is very, very low. But even when you accept that we're not going for kind of shared metrics frameworks, shared methodologies, each organization is doing their own thing, if the mindset and mentality and view of underpinning those systems is still based on complicatedness rather than complexity, you're still going to have the same issue, that your measurement framework is, if it's trying to kind of break things up into log frames and all the components of impact, you add these up, you do that intervention, and this is what will happen. When you're operating in a complex context, the work isn't going to achieve what it needs to achieve, and the measurement framework isn't going to tell you very much. So it applies at multiple levels, even at an organizational level. You still need to, if you're accepting our argument that actually problems are complex in nature, not complicated, then you need to be thinking, well, how do we build an approach to the work that is in line with that? And then how do we build measurement processes that are consistent?
I'm going to just we've got 10 minutes left. We've got 2 questions in play at the moment. So I'm going to go to Farhan next and then Fumi. But I am going to be facilitator and be a bit annoying and just add something else, because I think this is whirling around my head as well. With regards to particularly philanthropy is my background. That's where I've come from. I'm not from kind of the investing world. I think one of the main critiques that I had of a lot of the impact work in that space is that who defines impact, and often it's philanthropists that aren't from communities deciding those metric levels that don't fit the spaces that they need to be, and actually then who defines kind of what good looks like and actually what success for those spaces looks like. Particularly, like, I can talk until the cows come home around kind of multiple complex needs and homelessness and systems change in that space. But I'm not going to take up more time because I'm going to go to you guys. So Farhan, and I apologize, that probably isn't how you pronounce your name either.
No, it's fine, it's fine. Thank you, Hannah. And thank you, Jess, for the presentation. I am mostly interested in the part of mindset change process. And I was wondering, how did you manage inside your organization in Transcap, with your colleagues, your investors and stakeholders? Well, how did this process look like?
I mean, I think it's ongoing. I wouldn't say it's something that we have already managed. It's also not something that we're doing alone. So internally we have it's just an ongoing conversation about how to, as we develop the methodology, because you bring so much of your kind of background assumptions and politics and everything into this view of what's investment for, what's measurement for, what does success look like. In terms of the wider stakeholder group, so we have colleagues at Twist, is the another kind of membership organization in this space who we're working with. We've got Anna Hutchinson on the call, who's one of the team there, and they're actually actively convening a conversation around investor mindsets and inner transformation work, like how to go all the way into how are investors showing up, and how, if you are an investor, how do you even begin to move into this space that we're saying you need to move into. So really appreciative of the work that Twist are doing there to explore that question in more depth.
Thanks, Jess. Fumi, do you want to head off? No, that's not the right words. Don't head off, don't go anywhere. Take the floor, go for it.
Okay, thank you. So I just wanted to, we're still in the early stage of trying to explore this space as well, but just wanted to share like an example as our food of thought. I would really appreciate your comments. But one of the system change investing that we're working on is we set up a wellness fund. It's still within the traditional VC structure, but we are trying to utilize system change approach in terms of constructing the portfolio as well as making individual investments. So as an example, I put the link to the chat. We invested in this pharmaceutical company that has that can treat cancers in a very mild way. So the aim is to shift the medical paradigm, very much focus on measuring the outcome of medicine in terms of reducing the cancer cells when actually people are suffering a lot and sacrificing their quality of life, to the wellness paradigm that they get to, like, the system appreciates the whole more holistic notion of wellness and health. So the measurement that we're still working on, so this is not official or anything, but we've been thinking about, for instance, what if we measure at the very end of the day how government approves medicine is based on not only the reduction of cancer cells, but also the increase of the quality of life that the medicine can provide. On the path of that, what if we measure that kind of like wellness research is becoming a mainstream in the medical academic conferences and papers? What if we measure that, like count the number of papers or something like that? But still there's a question about, okay, this is still investment in single point solution. So through this, how can we expand our intervention? How can we design and construct our portfolio, not only through investments? How can we measure this collaborative movement together with other people? I think not only us measuring this is not gonna shift any paradigm. I think definitely to the question about attribution or additionality that's been really going on in the traditional investing's measurement, IMM. I think that's going to be a big question mark when we want to measure the system change. Yeah, so these, and also I think whether there is any difference between measuring so that example of idea of measuring is a system level metrics, but is that really capturing the holistic scope of the system as a whole, that whether it's shifted or not? Maybe we're just taking a system level, but we're just taking part of that system and then just measuring if we measure like the change of regulation, but that's not the whole of the system. So those are the questions that we're still facing. So I just wanted to share like an example for critics.
No, that's brilliant, and yeah, really nice to see you here, because I know we talked a bit at the summit, and yeah, with this project as well, you can see it's still at these early stages. That I got a few thoughts on that, and there are maybe others that want to chip in well, in the very little time we have left. One is that there's multiple levels at which the kind of complexity can be felt. So there's kind of within the human body itself, like the complexity of understanding cancer, cancerous cells, the balance between treating cancer and overall wellness. So that in itself is difficult to kind of get hold of. And then you've got this broader system of healthcare, this healthcare system, and all the different players. I think this is where the connection between the way you do the work and the way you measure and evaluate things is very clear, because taking a fully kind of systemic investing approach, as you pointed out, you're looking at single asset investments at the moment. So broadening that out would involve a kind of systems mapping process of some kind, and that gives you the framing to understand what you're trying to achieve and what indicators might tell you. So in the absence of that framing, it's you need something to put the numbers into. You need a way to, you need a grounding before you're asking what a metric can tell you, because
we did go through the system mapping together with it. Yeah. It was a very good learning process, and the way to engage the company as well, apparently.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
So that I mean, and this is clearly a longer conversation that we could have. But I think there's that overall point of metrics never tell you something on their own, and this applies to any kind of,
that's true,
any setting where you're trying to gather data about the world, that you need your framing and your grounding to tell you why you're looking for that metric. And then once you've got that information, it gives you a way of deriving meaning from the information point.
I
and
agree.
Measurement is flawed because it doesn't pay enough attention to that. It just jumps straight to metrics. So bringing that metric into the kind of systems analysis is where you can start. But anyway, I appreciate you were just sharing an example, so it's a really helpful point of reference. But yes, Hannah, we're getting towards the end, aren't we? We
are getting towards the end, and I'm always very deliberate that your time is precious, so we absolutely won't run over. But the chat was amazing. Thank you so much for coming. The questions were incredibly insightful. Jess, as ever, wonderful presentation and lots of thought-provoking big things and little things throughout that. So thank you very much, everybody. I hope you have wonderful rest of the days, whatever time you're at, and that wherever you are, your weather is good to you. See you all soon.